October 1944. The rain hammered down on the British command post somewhere in the hills of northern Italy, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud that sucked at boots and swallowed equipment whole. Inside a cramped tent, lit by a single kerosene lamp that flickered with every gust of wind, Captain Robert Hayes stared at a pigeon cage with barely concealed frustration. His uniform was still damp from the morning inspection, and his hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. He hadn't slept properly in 4 days, living on weak coffee and nervous energy as the autumn offensive ground forward with brutal slowness. The bird inside the cage looked back at him with one eye, tilting its head in that peculiar way pigeons do, as if mocking his predicament and finding amusement in his growing desperation. This wasn't just any pigeon. This was number 47, and every man in the signals unit had a name for it, though none of them was flattering. Corporal Jenkins called it the Flying Disaster. Private Matthews referred to it as His Majesty's most useless asset. Even the usually diplomatic Sergeant Reynolds had been heard muttering about the bird being proof that God had a sense of humor, and not a particularly kind one. Hayes rubbed his eyes and looked at the stack of incident reports on his makeshift desk. Each one documented another failure by number 47, written in the clipped military prose that somehow made the bird's incompetence even more absurd. Released with message at 0600 hours, returned to wrong loft at 1400 hours. Dispatched with urgent intelligence, found 3 hours later sitting on a fence post 2 kilometers from launch point. Sent with coordinates for artillery strike, discovered next morning in the mess tent attempting to eat someone's breakfast. The bird had failed its last 3 missions. Released with urgent messages, it had returned to the wrong lofts, flown in circles for hours, and once had simply landed in a tree and refused to move until someone climbed up to retrieve it. In one particularly memorable incident, number 47 had been sent with critical information about enemy troop movements, and had instead flown directly into the officers' mess during lunch, causing a minor panic and ruining Colonel Henderson's soup. The colonel, a man not known for his patience, had suggested in colorful language that the bird might serve the war effort better as the main ingredient in that same soup. In a war where carrier pigeons were saving lives daily, flying through artillery fire and storms to deliver critical intelligence with remarkable precision and courage, number 47 had become something of a legend for all the wrong reasons. There were pigeons that had flown 200 kilometers through enemy fire without hesitation, birds that had delivered messages while wounded, their determination overcoming pain and injury. One famous pigeon named Duke had completed 47 successful missions, each one more dangerous than the last, earning medals and the admiration of everyone who knew his story. And then there was number 47, who couldn't seem to find its way back from the latrine without getting lost. The men called it useless, hopeless, the stupidest bird in His Majesty's pigeon service. Some suggested it should be retired, sent back to England, maybe used for something less demanding, like delivering messages between offices in the same building. Private Matthews had joked that even that might be too challenging, that the bird would probably end up in Scotland when trying to go from the first floor to the second. But pigeons were in short supply, and Hayes, despite his frustration and the mounting evidence that number 47 was simply not cut out for military service, couldn't quite bring himself to give up on the creature. There was something about the way it looked at him, that tilted head and curious eye, that suggested maybe there was more going on behind those feathers than anyone realized. Or maybe Hayes was just too tired to think straight anymore. If you're enjoying this story of courage against impossible odds, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history. What Hayes didn't know that cold October morning was that 2,000 men were about to depend on this supposedly worthless bird for their lives. The 23rd Infantry Brigade had pushed deep into enemy territory 3 days earlier, establishing a forward position in a valley that intelligence suggested was lightly defended. The plan had been sound, the execution flawless. They'd taken the position with minimal casualties, set up defensive lines, and prepared for the next phase of the offensive. But war has a way of making fools of even the best plans. Sergeant William Morrison had been with the 23rd Infantry Brigade since North Africa, back when the war was younger and so was he. He'd seen friends die in the desert sun, their bodies buried in sand that shifted and changed until you couldn't remember exactly where they lay. He'd watched good men break under the stress of constant combat, seen them lose themselves to fear or rage or the simple grinding exhaustion of too many days, with too little sleep and too much death. He'd learned that survival often came down to luck as much as skill, that being smart or strong or brave didn't guarantee you'd see tomorrow, only increased your odds slightly in a game where the house always had the advantage. Morrison was 32 years old, which made him ancient by infantry standards, and he carried the weight of those years in every movement. His left knee ached when the weather turned cold, courtesy of shrapnel from Tobruk. His hands bore scars from a dozen minor wounds that had seemed like nothing at the time but left their permanent marks. And his eyes had that 1,000-yard stare that everyone in the unit recognized, the look of someone who'd seen too much but couldn't afford to look away, because stopping meant dying. When the order came to advance into the valley, something in his gut told him it was wrong. Morrison had learned to trust that feeling, that instinctive warning that came from some part of the brain that processed patterns faster than conscious thought could follow. The intelligence reports were too clean, too optimistic. They showed enemy forces in retreat, disorganized and demoralized, falling back toward defensive positions in the north. The valley was described as lightly defended, maybe a few scattered patrols, nothing that a full brigade couldn't handle easily. It all made perfect sense on paper, the kind of textbook operation that staff officers love because it looked good in briefing rooms and sounded impressive in reports. But Morrison had been in North Africa when intelligence said the Germans were retreating, and instead they'd been preparing an ambush that killed 300 men in less than an hour. He'd been in Sicily when supposedly light resistance turned into house-to-house fighting that lasted 3 days and left him wondering if he'd ever stop smelling blood and cordite. He'd learned that intelligence reports told you what people at headquarters thought was happening, but what actually happened in the field was often something completely different, usually worse, and occasionally catastrophic. The first sign of trouble came on the second night. Morrison was checking the perimeter, walking the line of foxholes where men tried to sleep in shifts, always one eye open, rifles close at hand. The temperature had dropped with nightfall, and his breath came out in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the darkness. Above, the stars were brilliant, undimmed by artificial light, the kind of sky you never saw in England anymore. It would have been beautiful if Morrison had the luxury of appreciating beauty, but in his experience, beautiful nights were the ones when attacks came, when visibility was good and defenders were lulled by the peaceful appearance of their surroundings. He was near the eastern perimeter when he noticed something odd about the hills surrounding their position. Small lights, barely visible, moving in coordinated patterns. Not the random flicker of campfires or the steady glow of lanterns. These were deliberate, purposeful, the kind of lights that spoke of organization and planning. Morrison watched for 10 minutes, his heart rate increasing as the pattern became clearer. The lights were marking positions, probably artillery spotters, confirming coordinates and fields of fire. The 23rd was surrounded by high ground on 3 sides, perfect terrain for an ambush, if you had heavy weapons positioned correctly. He reported it immediately to Lieutenant Jameson, a young officer fresh from England who still believed wars were won by following the manual and maintaining proper military bearing. Jameson had arrived 3 weeks ago with shiny boots and pressed uniforms, carrying a leather-bound notebook where he recorded observations about tactics and leadership for the book he planned to write after the war. Morrison had seen a dozen officers like him over the years. Some learned quickly and became decent leaders. Others got people killed before reality caught up with their theories. Jameson listened to Morrison's report with visible skepticism, his face illuminated by the small flashlight he used to consult his maps. "Those are probably just civilian lights," he said with the confidence of someone who'd never been ambushed. "There are farms in these hills, families who've lived here for generations. They use lanterns, Sergeant. Sometimes they move around. It doesn't mean we're about to be attacked." His voice carried that particular tone of educated patience that officers used when they thought enlisted men were letting their nerves get the better of them. Morrison bit back his initial response, forcing himself to stay professional. "With respect, sir, I've seen civilian lights before. This is different. The pattern is too regular, too coordinated. I think we should increase the watch rotation and get some scouts up into those hills to check it out." Jameson shook his head, making a notation in his leather notebook. "The intelligence reports show minimal enemy presence in this sector. We need our men rested for tomorrow's advance, not jumping at shadows because of some distant lights. Maintain current watch rotation, Sergeant. That's an order." Morrison saluted and walked away, his jaw tight with frustration and growing fear. He'd followed orders all his life, believed in the chain of command, understood that discipline was what held an army together. But he'd also learned that officers could be wrong, that rank didn't guarantee wisdom, and that sometimes following orders meant watching men die for no good reason. He couldn't disobey directly, but he could make sure his section stayed alert, could position the men in his squad where they'd have the best chance when the attack came, because it would come. Morrison was as certain of that as he was of his own name. By dawn of the 3rd day, the trap had closed with mechanical precision. Morrison was awake before first light, as he always was, his body trained by years of combat to wake in that hour before dawn when attacks most often came. He was brewing coffee over a small fire, using grounds that had already been used twice and would be used again because supplies were tight when the first shell screamed overhead. The distinctive whistle gave him maybe 2 seconds of warning. He dove for the nearest foxhole, hitting the dirt hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs, and then the world exploded. German artillery positions that weren't supposed to exist opened fire simultaneously from 3 sides. The barrage was precise and devastating, the product of careful planning and those lights Morrison had seen the night before. Shells walked through the camp with methodical efficiency, destroying vehicles, supply dumps, communication equipment. The radio truck took a direct hit in the first 30 seconds, vaporizing the equipment and everyone inside. The backup radio was damaged by shrapnel before anyone could get it operational. In less than 5 minutes, the 23rd was pinned down, caught in a killing zone with no clear route of retreat and no way to call for help. The noise was overwhelming, a physical force that pressed against your chest and made coherent thought nearly impossible. Between the artillery explosions came the crack of rifle fire, the chatter of machine guns, the screams of wounded men calling for medics who were already overwhelmed with casualties. Morrison pulled himself out of the foxhole and began moving through the chaos, organizing defensive positions, because that's what sergeants did, because someone had to try to bring order to the disaster unfolding around them. He found Lieutenant Jameson in what remained of the command post, his face pale with shock and the realization that he'd been catastrophically wrong. The young officer was staring at a map as if it might offer some explanation for how the intelligence reports had been so mistaken, how an area described as lightly defended had turned into a kill zone. Morrison didn't waste time on recriminations. "We need to pull back to the farmhouse," he shouted over the noise of explosions. "It's stone construction. Better cover. We consolidate there and hold until we can get word out." Jameson nodded, seeming grateful that someone was making decisions, and together they began organizing the withdrawal. Lieutenant Jameson worked frantically to repair the backup radio, his hands shaking as shells exploded closer with each passing minute. He'd been trained in radio operation at officer school, spent 2 weeks learning about frequency modulation and signal transmission in a comfortable classroom in Surrey, where the biggest danger was paper cuts from training manuals. Nothing had prepared him for trying to solder connections while the ground shook and men died around him. The radio's power supply had taken shrapnel damage. The antenna was bent and possibly broken. The frequency crystal might be cracked. Each problem he identified revealed 2 more, a cascade of failures that mirrored his own mistakes over the past 3 days. Morrison organized the defensive positions, moving between foxholes and encouraging the men even as he calculated their dwindling chances with the cold mathematics of survival. He'd been through enough battles to know how to read the signs, to estimate how long they could hold based on ammunition expenditure, casualty rates, and enemy pressure. Private Collins had taken a bullet through the shoulder and was bleeding badly, but would probably survive if they could get him to a field hospital in the next few hours. Corporal Davis had caught shrapnel in the chest and would be dead by nightfall, no matter what anyone did. Sergeant Thompson's entire squad had been wiped out in the first barrage, 8 men gone in seconds. They had ammunition for maybe 6 more hours of sustained combat, and that was assuming they didn't face a concentrated assault. Food for 2 days if they rationed strictly, but hunger was the least of their concerns. Water was already running low, the supply truck destroyed in the opening minutes of the attack, and the weather was turning. Morrison could feel it in his bones, that old knee injury giving him advance warning better than any meteorologist. Dark clouds were rolling in from the north, bringing with them the promise of one of those autumn storms that turned the Italian countryside into an impassable bog and made close air support impossible. He did the math 3 times, hoping he'd made an error, but the answer was always the same. Without reinforcements, without air support, without some way to get word to headquarters, the 23rd would be overrun within 24 hours. They could hold longer if they were willing to accept massive casualties, could fight to the last man if ordered to do so, but Morrison had seen enough futile stands to know how those stories ended, brave men dying for nothing because someone at headquarters didn't know they needed help. In the command post, a converted farmhouse cellar that shook with each nearby explosion and filled with dust that made breathing difficult, Captain Andrew Davies faced an impossible decision. He was 43 years old, had joined the Army in 1939, expecting a short war and rapid promotion, and had instead spent 5 years learning that war was mostly about making terrible choices and living with the consequences. The radio was beyond repair. Jameson had finally admitted that, after 4 hours of trying, his voice breaking with exhaustion and shame, their position was untenable, surrounded on 3 sides with no realistic chance of breaking through enemy lines. If they didn't get word out within hours, they'd be overrun or forced to surrender, and Davies wasn't sure which option he hated more. He had 3 carrier pigeons with him, kept in a reinforced cage that had survived the initial barrage through sheer luck. Standard procedure for units operating in forward positions required 3 pigeons, redundancy built into a system that recognized how fragile communication could be in combat. 2 were reliable birds with proven track records, veterans of multiple successful missions. Number 18 had completed 12 flights without a single failure, earning a reputation as one of the best pigeons in the service. Number 29 was younger, but had shown exceptional navigation skills and training and 3 successful combat missions. Both birds were in good health, alert and responsive, ready to do their duty. The third pigeon was number 47, included almost as an afterthought because regulations required 3 pigeons per forward unit, and someone at supply had to fill the quota. Davies had argued against including it, had pointed out the bird's record of failures. But regulations were regulations, and sometimes the system ground forward regardless of common sense. Now here he was, staring at 3 birds, and knowing that his decision would determine whether 2,000 men lived or died. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to do anything except stare at the cage and wonder if he was about to sacrifice good men because of bureaucratic requirements and bad luck. The storm broke just after noon with a violence that seemed personal, as if nature itself had decided to take sides in the war. Rain fell in sheets so thick you could barely see 10 meters ahead, turning the world into a gray blur where solid objects dissolved into shadows and shapes. The wind howled through the valley with a sound like wounded animals, bending trees until they seemed ready to snap, tearing at the canvas shelters the men had erected and sending loose equipment tumbling across the muddy ground. Lightning split the sky at irregular intervals, each flash momentarily illuminating the battlefield in stark white light that made the destruction seem even more surreal. In these conditions, asking a pigeon to fly was nearly suicidal, and every man in the cellar knew it. The birds relied on visual landmarks for navigation, recognizing terrain features and following routes they'd learned through training and instinct. They also used the Earth's magnetic field, some biological compass that science didn't fully understand, but that worked with remarkable accuracy under normal circumstances. But heavy rain obscured visual landmarks, made everything look the same, turned familiar terrain into an alien landscape. And wind could disorient them, send them off course, or simply drive them to seek shelter and wait out the storm because that was what every survival instinct told them to do. But waiting wasn't an option. German forces were preparing for a final push. Morrison had confirmed that with reports from the forward positions. They'd been probing the British lines, testing for weaknesses, and the pattern suggested they'd attack in force within hours. The enemy commander was smart enough to realize the British couldn't communicate with headquarters, knew that no reinforcements would arrive, understood that this was an opportunity to destroy an entire brigade with minimal risk. Without reinforcements, without artillery support, without even the threat of airstrikes, the 23rd would be annihilated. 2,000 men would be killed or captured because a storm had made communication impossible and their radios had been destroyed in the opening minutes of an ambush that never should have happened. Davies released the first pigeon at 1:15 p.m., his hands careful despite their trembling from cold and fear. Number 18 was a strong bird, had flown through worse than this, or at least that's what he told himself as he prepared for the release. The pigeon's muscles felt tense under his fingers, its heart beating rapidly against his palm. He whispered words of encouragement that felt foolish even as he spoke them, then stepped to the cellar entrance where rain immediately soaked his uniform. The wind tried to tear the bird from his hands, but he held firm, waiting for a brief lull in the gusts, then opened his fingers and watched the pigeon launch into the storm. Number 18 circled once, fighting the wind with powerful wing beats, getting its bearings despite the reduced visibility. Then it oriented itself toward headquarters and flew straight into the storm with a determination that was almost inspiring. Davies watched until the bird disappeared into the gray chaos, swallowed by rain and wind within seconds. The men in the cellar stood silent, listening to the thunder mixing with artillery fire, hoping that somehow the bird would make it through 60 kilometers of the worst weather northern Italy had seen in months. But hope and reality are different things in war, and everyone present knew the odds were terrible. 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Every minute felt like an hour as they waited for some sign that the message had gotten through, that help was coming, that they hadn't just sent a brave bird to its death for nothing. When no response came, when the artillery continued and no British counter-battery fire arrived, Davies knew what he had to do. The second pigeon went up at 3:30, number 29, younger but promising, trained for exactly this kind of mission. This one was younger, but had shown promise in training, completing several difficult flights in bad weather that had impressed the instructors at the Pigeon Service School. Davies held number 29 for a moment before release, feeling the rapid heartbeat under his fingers, the tension in its small body. The bird seemed to sense the danger, its eyes darting around at the storm, every instinct probably screaming that flying in these conditions was madness. But pigeons had been bred for generations to overcome fear, to fly toward home no matter what obstacles lay between. Davies whispered another useless prayer, then opened his hands and watched the bird launch into the wind. This bird didn't even manage a full circle. A gust caught it, tumbled it sideways like a leaf in a hurricane, and slammed it into the side of a ruined barn 30 meters away with a sickening thud that Davies heard even over the storm. The men found it an hour later, one wing bent at an unnatural angle, huddled under a piece of corrugated metal and shaking with pain and shock. It would never fly again. That left number 47, the stupidest pigeon in the service, the bird that couldn't find its way home on a clear day with perfect visibility and a following wind. Now they were asking it to fly through what had become a full gale, through rain so heavy it was like flying through a waterfall, with artillery shells exploding randomly across the valley and wind that could snap a pigeon's wings like twigs. Sergeant Morrison watched Davies prepare the bird and felt something break inside him, some last reserve of hope finally giving way to despair. They were going to die here because their last hope was a creature that had proven itself worthless time and again, that couldn't complete simple missions in good weather, that had become a running joke among men who desperately needed something to laugh about in a war that offered so little amusement. Morrison wasn't a religious man, hadn't prayed since childhood, but he found himself forming silent words in his mind anyway. Not prayers exactly, more like negotiations with whatever force controlled the universe, bargaining for the lives of men who deserved better than to die in a muddy valley because of bad intelligence and worse luck. He thought about his sister back in Manchester, about how she'd received the telegram informing her that her brother had been killed in action in Italy, about how she'd never know the full story of how he died waiting for help that never came because a pigeon couldn't fly straight. But Davies noticed something odd as he handled number 47, something that gave him pause despite his desperation. The bird wasn't panicking. Most pigeons grew agitated in storms, their entire bodies going tense with fear, sensing the danger on some instinctive level and knowing that flying in such conditions went against every survival instinct millions of years of evolution had bred into them. They would flutter their wings nervously, make distressed sounds, try to burrow deeper into their cages, seeking safety. Davies had released hundreds of pigeons over the years, and he knew the signs of a bird that was terrified, that understood it was being sent into danger and wanted no part of it. But number 47 was calm, almost eerily so. It sat in Davies's hands with that same slightly confused expression, that head tilt that had made so many soldiers laugh at it. But there was something different in its eyes now, an alertness, maybe, or a focus that Davies had never noticed before. The bird looked toward the storm, then back at Davies, then toward the storm again, as if measuring something, calculating odds in whatever passed for thought in a pigeon's brain. And, in that moment, holding a supposedly worthless bird while 2,000 men waited to die, Davies made a decision that defied logic and protocol and everything he'd learned about pigeons in 5 years of military service. He would give the bird a chance, not because he believed it would succeed, but because doing nothing guaranteed their destruction. The message tube was attached carefully to the pigeon's leg, containing coordinates, situation report, an urgent request for artillery support and evacuation. Davies walked to the cellar entrance, holding the bird carefully against the wind that threatened to tear it from his hands. Rain lashed at his face, making it hard to breathe. Morrison stood beside him, watching. Around them, the sounds of battle continued, the screams of wounded men mixing with explosions and the constant roar of the storm. Number 47 was released at 3:47 p.m. For a moment, it simply sat in Davies's palm, rain streaming off its feathers, looking almost comical with its bedraggled appearance. Then it launched, and something remarkable happened. Instead of fighting the wind, the bird seemed to flow with it, using the gusts rather than resisting them. It spiraled upward in a pattern that looked chaotic but was actually calculated, finding pockets of calmer air between the worst of the wind shears. Within moments, it had climbed above the immediate storm layer and disappeared into the gray clouds. Back at the command post, 60 kilometers away, Captain Hayes was trying to coordinate a response to scattered reports of German activity when a signals corporal burst into his tent. A pigeon had just arrived, in terrible condition, barely able to stand. Hayes felt his heart sink as he recognized the bird. Number 47. Of course it had gotten lost again. Probably had been flying around for days before stumbling back to the loft by sheer accident. But when he removed the message tube, his hands went cold. The coordinates indicated a position that wasn't supposed to be contested. The situation report described a full-scale ambush, casualties mounting, ammunition critical, 2,000 men trapped and dying while headquarters sat in ignorance. Hayes sprinted to the operations center, bursting in on a planning meeting with enough urgency that 3 officers reached for sidearms before recognizing him. He thrust the message at the colonel, words tumbling out about the 23rd, the valley, the trap. The colonel's face went white as he read. How long ago was this sent? Less than 3 hours. In this storm? The pigeon flew in this storm? Hayes nodded, still trying to catch his breath. It was impossible, absolutely impossible, but the bird had done it. The stupidest pigeon in the service had just completed what might be the most difficult flight in the entire war. Orders went out within minutes. Artillery positions were redirected, their coordinates carefully calculated to strike around the 23rd's position without hitting friendly forces. Fighter bombers were scrambled despite the weather, their pilots grim-faced but determined. And a relief column was assembled, tanks and infantry rushing toward the valley even as the storm continued to rage. It would be close, too close, but now at least they had a chance. In the valley, Morrison noticed the change first. The German artillery had been maintaining a steady rate of fire, softening up the British positions for the final assault. But suddenly it stopped. For 30 seconds, the world was quiet except for the storm. Then British shells began falling on the enemy positions, perfectly targeted, devastating. The men in the foxholes looked at each other in disbelief. Someone had gotten word out. They weren't alone anymore. The battle that followed was brutal but brief. The German forces, caught between the defending 23rd and the incoming relief column, withdrew in disorder. By nightfall, the valley was secure and the wounded were being evacuated. Out of 2,000 men, 347 had been killed or seriously wounded. It was a terrible toll, but without that message, without reinforcements, the number would have been 2,000. Captain Davies stood in the rain that night, watching the last of the wounded being loaded onto trucks, and thought about a ridiculous pigeon with a tilted head. He'd sent 3 birds into the storm. 2 had been strong, proven, reliable. Both had failed. The third had been a joke, a creature mocked by everyone who knew it, and that bird had saved them all. Number 47 arrived back at the command post the next morning, flying into the loft as casually as if it had been on a training exercise. The other pigeons ignored it, as they always did. It wasn't part of their social hierarchy, wasn't one of the successful birds that the others respected. It just was, peculiar and unimpressive, tilting its head at the world with that same vaguely ridiculous expression. But Hayes looked at it differently now. He'd spent the night thinking about courage, about how we define success, about the assumptions we make about worth and ability. They'd called this bird stupid because it didn't behave like other pigeons, didn't follow the expected patterns. But when the stakes were absolute, when every proven method had failed, this odd little creature had found a way through, not in spite of its differences, but perhaps because of them. Word spread through the command structure. The story of Number 47 became legend, told and retold in mess halls and briefing rooms throughout Italy. Some of the details changed in the telling, as they always do with legends, but the core remained true. A bird that everyone had written off had saved 2,000 lives by doing what no one thought possible. Sergeant Morrison survived the war and returned to England in 1946. He never talked much about his experiences. Like many veterans, found the memories too heavy for a casual conversation. But he kept a photograph on his mantle, taken a week after the Valley battle. It showed a group of soldiers, dirty and exhausted but alive, gathered around a pigeon cage. In the center of the frame, Number 47 looked at the camera with its characteristic tilted head, utterly unaware that it had done anything extraordinary. Lieutenant Jameson, who'd learned hard lessons about listening to experienced soldiers and trusting instinct over optimism, requested that Number 47 be awarded the Dickin Medal, the highest honor for animals serving in the military. The request was approved, though the ceremony was quiet, nothing like the public celebrations for human heroes. Hayes placed the medal on the pigeon's cage, and the bird completely ignored it, more interested in the fresh feed that had been provided. Captain Davies never forgot the image of that bird launching into the storm, the moment of decision when everything hung in the balance. Years later, running a small bookshop in Cornwall, he would sometimes tell customers about the pigeon that saved his life. Most thought it was just a war story, the kind old soldiers tell to make their experiences seem more dramatic. But those who looked closely at Davies' face while he spoke could see it was something more. It was a lesson learned in the hardest way possible about humility and judgment and the danger of deciding something is worthless just because it doesn't fit our expectations. The storm that day had been one of the worst of the autumn season. Meteorologists later confirmed that wind speeds had exceeded 60 kilometers per hour, with gusts up to 90. Visibility had been near zero. The 2 pigeons that failed weren't weak or poorly trained. They were simply overwhelmed by conditions that would have stopped any normal bird. But Number 47, with its odd flying style and unusual behavior, had somehow found a way through the chaos. Some experts suggested the bird's previous failures might have been due to a different kind of intelligence, one that didn't follow standard pigeon patterns, but adapted to circumstances in unique ways. Others thought it was simply luck, right bird at the right time. Hayes didn't care about explanations. He'd learned something fundamental that day about the difference between convention and wisdom, between doing things the accepted way and finding solutions that actually work. The war ended 8 months later. The pigeon service was disbanded, its birds retired or released. Number 47 was given to Hayes, who took it home to his farm in Yorkshire. The bird lived another 3 years, spending its days wandering the yard with the same slightly confused expression, occasionally flying up to the roof and sitting there for hours, tilting its head at the sky. Hayes never tried to understand what the pigeon was thinking. He just made sure it had food, water, and a safe place to sleep. When number 47 died, Hayes buried it in his garden under an apple tree. No ceremony, no dramatic words, just a quiet acknowledgement that something important had passed. He carved a small wooden marker with the number 47 and the date of the Valley Battle. Visitors to the farm never knew what it meant, and Hayes preferred it that way. Some stories don't need to be told loudly to be important. Sergeant Morrison came to visit once in the spring of 1949. He and Hayes sat in the garden drinking tea and not saying much, the way veterans often do when there aren't words adequate for shared experience. Morrison finally asked to see where the bird was buried. Hayes showed him the marker under the apple tree, now covered with spring blossoms. Morrison stood there for a long time, hands in pockets, looking at nothing in particular. Then he nodded once and walked away. Hayes understood. They both did. Sometimes the bravest thing is just to keep going when everyone expects you to fail, to find your own way through the storm even when the path isn't clear, to be exactly what you are instead of what others think you should be. Number 47 had taught them that. A stupid pigeon that saved 2,000 lives by simply refusing to accept that impossible meant impossible. The apple tree grew strong over the years, its roots nourished by the ground where a remarkable bird rested. Every autumn it produced fruit, crisp and sweet, and Hayes would think about storms and courage and the unexpected ways that heroism manifests. He never called it a miracle, never attributed supernatural qualities to what happened that day. It was simpler and more profound than that. It was about persistence and character and the stubborn refusal to be what others expected, qualities that mattered more than strength or speed or any measurable advantage. In the end, that's what they would remember. Not the stupidity they'd mocked, but the courage they'd witnessed. Not the failures that had made them laugh, but the success that had saved them. Number 47 flew into the storm not because it was fearless, but because it was needed. And sometimes that's what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear or doubt, but the decision to fly anyway, into the wind and rain and chaos, carrying hope through the darkness until finally, impossibly, you reach the other side and deliver your message. 2,000 men lived because one small creature refused to accept that the storm was too strong, the distance too far, the task impossible. They called it the stupidest war pigeon. But those who survived that October day knew better. They knew they'd witnessed something rare and precious, a reminder that greatness sometimes comes in unexpected packages, that heroes don't always look the part, and that the measure of worth isn't in appearance or reputation, but in action, when everything is on the line and there's no one else to make the flight through the storm.